All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We are going to continue our discussion on speciation and really sort of talk about these interesting situations called hybrid zones. So these are regions in which members of what we would assume are different species based on other characteristics and classifications are capable of getting to this zone, mating, and producing hybrids. So hybrids are the result of matings between species with incomplete reproductive barriers. So when we go back to those prezygotic or postzygotic um, isolation mechanisms, these are not complete. So they are capable of producing these hybrids. Think about the mule from a horse and a donkey. That's an idea of a hybrid. All right, they're capable of successfully producing viable offspring. Then it's the question of, well, what happens to those hybrids? Um, Oftentimes, those hybrids will have some sort of reduced fitness comparably with the two parent species, and in which case the distribution of those zones can be incredibly complex if those parent species are found in patches within the same region. So, we're looking at these hybrid zones, something like this example with our toads in Europe. And if we go to this edge of Europe, closer more towards Russia, we get these fire-bellied toads, and that's their major geographic range. We get over here more in the territory of things like Italy. You get these yellow-bellied toads, and yet there's this line in between those more distinct populations. That's what we're talking about with this hybrid zone. And so they'll interact, they'll mate, and produce offspring, even though we would distinguish these two as two separate species. So the question then becomes, what happens in these hybrid zones? What's the outcome for those species? And really it can end up falling into one of three categories based on characteristics of the hybrids themselves. We can talk about reinforcement, where we continually sort of limit this hybrid zone. It gets smaller and smaller. This speciation becomes more and more complete, and eventually they become two distinct species no longer capable of producing those hybrid offspring. Sometimes, if the selection isn't quite strong enough, they can actually fuse back together and actually become a single species again. Or it can just be stable, and they just kind of hang out there. They produce those offspring, but they never fully diverge in terms of their characteristics, probably genetic structure being the biggest, and yet they never quite come back together as a single population either. So reinforcement, again, is just that strengthening of that reproductive barrier, and this often is what happens when those hybrids are less fit than their parent species, whether they are physically weak or just not capable of producing viable offspring for themselves or just weakened offspring, whatever the case might be. Um, so long as that selective pressure is continually there and favoring those parent species, excuse me, the way that they are, then that rate of hybridization will decrease over time. So their capability of continually producing those offspring, those hybrid offspring, doesn't really happen. Interesting thing, we seem to see these reproductive barriers should be stronger for sympatric rather than allopatric species, so that the way that they actually speciate um, does seem to matter in terms of the way that they're isolated. So the more that they are within a single population, or I should say a single geographic area, those two populations, their mating behavior, for example, in this particular one with the species, so long as that geographic area is overlapping, but they have that mate choice in place, then we actually see a much stronger reinforcement and much quicker movement away from these hybrid zones than when we get in a situation where they actually got geographically isolated and then over time they end up speciating from there. Fusion is the weakening of those reproductive barriers, so something is happening. They had started down this path of divergence, and something has changed in their environment to actually pull them back into being a single species. So go back to that cichlid example we talked about in the last video, and there's enough gene flow in those populations to allow for them to potentially continue to mate together. But in normal light, under normal conditions, they just won't do it. And so that's why we consider them separate species. But there's an interesting example in Lake Victoria in Africa where there's so much pollution in that lake that it actually reduces the ability of those female cichlids to distinguish their males. There's so much soot and silt and other pollution that sort of grays out their environment, and so they can't see each other clear enough to distinguish the different colors. The females can't see the male's coloration well enough, and so she's just going to mate with whoever she finds because she needs to be able to have that biological drive to push her genes forward. So we're actually seeing a refusion of these cichlid fish back into this sort of single species because they just can't see the coloration, so it doesn't matter anymore. Stability is where we're going to continue the formation of those hybrid offspring. They don't really seem to be lesser than their parent species. They're not more successful. Conditions seem to stay relatively stable, and there's enough gene flow coming from outside of that particular hybrid zone that just completely overwhelms the increased reproductive isolation within that zone, and so they kind of just stay there. For all intensive purposes, we're sort of doing this with that mule example. They will continue to occur more than likely because we're giving enough opportunity and enough mating occurrences between those horses and donkeys, so we're forcing the stability of that mule hybrid, even though if nature were to take over, it probably wouldn't happen at all.